Hello and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is Julia, and I am thrilled to introduce our next guest, Paige. One of the things I love about this episode is it just really speaks to how altruistic and selfless people can be. Paige was born with Turner syndrome, which affects your chromosomes at conception. And as a result, she was born with underdeveloped ovaries. As she describes it, she has no ovarian tissue. And so as a result, you can imagine that it is impossible for her to have and ultimately carry babies. And yet, in this story, you're going to hear about two extremely selfless acts. And every time I think that maybe altruism no longer exists, that people don't show up for one another in really big ways, I think about Paige's story, and this is like selflessness beyond and above anything I've ever heard before. It's really amazing. One of the things that you'll hear Paige talk about quite a bit, actually, is that the symbol for people with Turner syndrome is the butterfly. It's sort of like the mark or the trademark. And so, I was thinking about the community of altruistic people that came together to aid Paige and her husband in their family building journey. And I ended up Googling, what is a group of butterflies called? Because there's sometimes you think about other animals and they have interesting names for their babies or for their groups. And it turns out that, Dr. Google tells me that a group of butterflies is called a kaleidoscope, which is so cool because if you think about a kaleidoscope, that little tool, that device that you turn and all the colors shift to make brand new patterns and brand new meaning. If you think about a kaleidoscope, it's all these different colors coming together to make something really beautiful and something that regularly shifts and evolves. And I think that's just the best way to describe Paige's story, or any of our stories, really. Our life journeys are these kaleidoscopes of beautiful beings and people that come into them. And as they shift and evolve, the images get more and more beautiful. So with that intro, welcome, Paige. Really hope you like this episode. I also hope you enjoy Stork'd, the podcast. And please, 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 if you do, share it with friends and help spread the word. Thank you. Here's Paige. Welcome, Paige, to Stork'd, the podcast. I am so excited to share your story. It is unlike many that I've heard today. So I'd love to share with our audience a little bit about what's going on currently for you and where you're headed in your family building. We're sort of at a point, as I understand it, that's at the interim phase of family building. So we'll get there. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm super happy to be here. I am Paige, as she mentioned, and that's the perfect terminology or the perfect way to put it, interim phase, where we are using alternative methods to family build. And we're in that space where we're figuring out how to make that happen, what that looks like for us. We have some pieces of that completed and figured out. Other pieces are still kind of up in the air. Some pieces aren't done because they cost a lot of money. So there's a lot of that, but I really appreciate the terminology and I might actually have to just start using it, interim phase. Because, we've been married for almost 6 years now in September. And we get that question all the time, when our baby's coming, when you're going to have kids, especially when we first got married is when we really got that. And it was not anything I shied away from. I would just quickly explain, we have to use alternative methods. So it's going to look a little different for us. And
yeah.
People were receptive to hearing that. And I know for some people in the infertility space, that's a very difficult question. For me, I never shied away because I think it's a learning moment. Not that it's necessarily my job to teach people, but they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah, I think that's fair. My mom jokes. She listened to my podcast when I first released it and then, has been paying attention to having 3 millennial daughters. She at one point said, I don't understand why everything with you millennials is a journey. What's with this word journey? In my day, we just did something or we didn't do something. But I do think that acknowledging when you're working towards something and haven't yet realized it or may not ever realize it, that the journey framework or the interim framework is a better framework than like, ta-da, here's what happened. So,
yeah.
Well, let's start from the beginning a little bit. You've said that things have to look different for you and your husband. Mm-hmm. And I'd love if you could share with us a little bit about what that means for you. Why do things have to look differently for you? And then what is the definition of different in your family?
Such a great question. So things have to look different for us because when I was about 10 years old, I was diagnosed with something called Turner syndrome. So with that, that is a female-only chromosomal defect on your 23rd pair of chromosomes. So when I was being created, literally as like a baby in the uterus, the cells multiply. And on my 23rd pair of chromosomes, one of the X's that makes you a female started to delete. The two top arms started to delete on my chromosome. And so my bottom chromosomes kind of freaked out and said, don't delete, don't delete. And they duplicated. So I have what's called a mosaic form. So some of my cells will have the X and then the other X with the 4 long arms. And then other cells in my body are just going to have one X. So that is why Turner syndrome is a female-only chromosomal condition, because you can't survive without at least one X. But so I found out about this when I was 10. I was real short. I'm still pretty short. I'm almost 5'1". And I really started noticing in 4th grade, like, what is going on with this? So long story short, we go to the doctor and it started the journey, if you will, of getting diagnosed with a mosaic form of Turner syndrome. Because it affects your chromosomes that literally make you a female, it does affect some of your reproductive organs. And with that, I have what's called ovarian failure. So my ovaries never fully developed. In fact, I don't have any tissue there at this time. Some women with Turner syndrome will have some tissue there and things can happen, but it's mostly common to not be able to have your own children as a female with Turner syndrome.
That is such a helpful explanation of a, complicated medical diagnosis. And those of us who are not geneticists and who can understand, basically what you're saying is that your chromosomes are a little bit different and that happened as you were developing. You've explained it to me in the past as there's a wide range of implications. Can you tell us some of the implications? You've said that your ovaries may not develop. What are some of the general indicators or experiences of people with Turner syndrome?
There are a host of different types of symptoms that many Turner syndrome girls may or may not even have. Infertility being one that the majority of us do share, as I mentioned. Some of the other things are going to be that you are shorter in stature. Some may have a webbed neck. I do not have that. Some of us may have conditions with our heart. I did when I was little. I no longer do have that. So you can kind of see not only do a lot of these symptoms maybe change as you grow with Turner syndrome, because as you mentioned, it is such a complicated condition, but you may or may not even have them to begin with. Sometimes there are issues with the kidneys. There's some thyroid can be a big player. Weight, that's a big player. That's a big player really with many conditions that have to do with infertility or are connected with infertility already. So with Turner syndrome, we do take hormone supplements because we do not produce the hormones really the same way, since we don't have the ovaries and all of that kind of stuff going on. So we have to take hormone supplements. So I take it's called estradiol and prometrium. So they're basically estrogen and progesterone. And so that kind of just regulates me, keeps my body healthy, keeps a healthy cycle, which is really important for women in Turner syndrome. It's another implication that you might have, right? You may not menstruate on your own without the ovaries. So your endocrinologists are definitely going to be recommending that. And most people with Turner syndrome, myself included, should probably be seeing an endocrinologist a couple of times a year.
Okay, so that's really helpful. And first of all, you mentioned that it impacts women predominantly, impacts the ovarian and hormone systems primarily, some other factors as well, which definitely has a role, as we know, in building a family. It's fascinating to me because it's something that's so specific to one gender. And if you're willing to go here, the chromosomal definition of gender sort of comes into play a little bit, because when you're talking about what makes on a biological level somebody a man or a woman, it comes down to chromosomes. When it comes to other factors, there's many other ways that we can define ourselves and our identity.
That's right.
Tell me about how Turner syndrome has your identity.
Oh, that is such a beautiful question. And I think it's such an important topic to discuss today. especially since I do identify as a cisgendered woman. But there can be so many different factors that go into that for anybody today. So, wow, yeah, what a beautiful question. So with Turner syndrome, that it only happens to people who are biologically female when we're strictly just talking genetics. And for me, I feel like that almost empowered me in a way. It was a female issue in my mind. I connected with that as a female, and I feel like it almost in a way made me feel more connected to my biological and my mental sex and gender. And so I feel like it played a big role in that. Like I was like, yep, okay, I'm a girl and I've got this kind of girl syndrome condition. But it can be complicated because you do develop different sexually. And that is something that even the medical community is looking at identifying and, you know, trying to place into different brackets. And what kind of condition really is Turner syndrome then, since it only affects women? And so, you know, as it's learned about, I mean, I would say, and I could be completely wrong on this, but I would say that Turner syndrome wasn't even extremely heavily researched and easily diagnosed until maybe the late 80s, 90s. And that was just the beginning. So when I was born, they had no idea, you know, what I had. That's why it took till I was 10. Babies, now the family knows that this potential baby is going to have Turner syndrome and what to do and what to look forward. So in a way, you know, that could kind of freak parents out because it is such a spectrum of a condition. It just depends on how severe the amount of symptoms you have could be and how prominent those conditions. But so when I was born, I mean, it wasn't even something that was tested for. It had already been known as a condition, but it just wasn't something that you knew in utero.
Sure. And so you said you discovered this when you were 10. Mm-hmm. I imagine that unlike other infertility challenges that are not known until later, until you start the trying process with your partner or with the medical community, that it shapes you a little bit differently to go in as a 10-year-old and know this is something that's going to be a challenge for me in the future. Did you feel a sense of otherness or like you were different from the other kids or uncomfortable with that?
So for me, it kind of shaped my life as a whole. And I do feel lucky for that, as opposed to finding out married and 27, 28 years old, just trying and finding out. I do feel, you know, blessed that I was able to find out early on and kind of shape the dream of what my life looked like as a whole. You know, you're a little girl, you're 10 years old, you're thinking about what it's like to get married a little bit or what your future family might look like, what you want for your future. I'm a big planner. Once I knew that I could no longer have kids, which was probably a journey of figuring out between 10 to 15. As a kid, it's kind of hard to understand at 10 that you can't have kids. And then by 15, I was on the medication to start a cycle, the estrogen and the prometrium. And that made me kind of question to my parents, hey, wait, is that true for me? I know with Turner syndrome, I was always told that I might not be able to. And then they're like, yeah, like you can't. I'm like, okay. You know, it kind of was just that kind of quick of a family conversation. But so for me, it shaped in that I have known for a long time. And that's just how the picture of my family grew. I've always enjoyed children. I babysat, I nannied. I always knew that was going to be a part of my life. You know, part of Turner syndrome, and this is kind of funny, is that our symbol is the butterfly. And with that, the butterfly is so perfect because it makes us a social butterfly. So for me, I have always been willing to share my experience, and that has shaped what's going on today as well. And when my husband and I got married, he knew already, of course, that I couldn't have children. And I didn't even have to tell him while we were dating because I was such a social butterfly with that Turner syndrome butterfly icon, if you will, or mascot. He'd already known since he met me, basically, that I couldn't. I was that girl in high school that was open about the condition that they had. And at sleepovers, I'd have my little medications with me because I'd have to take them at night. And it wasn't a lot. It wasn't like a big hubbub. It was just, I wasn't going to let it stop me. You know, I wasn't going to let it hold me down. And I think everybody thought that was kind of cool. I grew up in a small town, not crazy small, but small enough where, it's one junior high, one high school.
So everyone in your community then knew because you were so open about it.
Basically, to the point of there was another baby born with Turner syndrome, and the daughter was a couple of grades younger than me. And I was going to be leaving recess when she was coming up the ramp, and I was going to be going down the big kid ramp. And she wanted to see me. She wanted to see what a Turner syndrome person looked like because she was nervous that her new baby sister had Turner syndrome. Now, I am not the poster child, nor do I try to be for Turner syndrome. In fact, sometimes it makes me feel a little bit anxious kind of thinking about that, because when you're putting yourself out there, sometimes you become kind of like a little bit of a spokesperson. And that has been something like at other events and stuff with Turner syndrome that they do want me to kind of go talk about, my education. I did earn a master's degree, and sometimes people with Turner syndrome can struggle a little bit with different learning disabilities. There's no intellectual delay, but there can be different learning disabilities. And so I think it does give parents a little bit of hope to kind of see somebody who kind of made it through, but also just because I did doesn't mean everybody has to, or that should be seen as the norm, especially with mosaic. I don't want to use the word guilt, but I don't have a better word. Mosaicism, meaning that it's the condition is not showing in every single one of my cells. Like I explained a little bit in the beginning, it does make my symptoms a little less severe. Now, one could argue that infertility is severe. That is, but the rest of the symptoms associated aren't as severe.
So if I'm just going to back up for a second, you're using this mascot, this butterfly emblem to articulate what it was like for you to grow up, that you were very social, you were very communicative about your Turner syndrome, and that as a result of both that and that your symptoms or the way it displays for you is a little bit different than how it displays for some other people. You've been looked to as a Turner syndrome icon or even mascot yourself, like the butterfly.
At times, yes.
Well, that must be really challenging to be that representative person. But since you've chosen to do it for us on this podcast, let's dive in a little bit to your fertility journey, because as I understand it, you've now been open. The whole community that you grew up in knows about this syndrome, knows about you, knows about how well you're doing and that you're thriving. And now you're married and you're thinking about building a family, knowing within the context and backdrop that you can't carry a child biologically. Tell us where you go from that. How do you think about family building?
It did feel daunting at first. And this is the perfect segue because that social butterfly piece really has a lot to do with this. So my husband and I looked into adoption, and that was one of the pieces that could have worked for us for family building. And with the social butterfly piece and everybody kind of knowing my story, one day I got a message. And this is one of those things that I feel so lucky about. And, and I hope anybody listening, I hope it doesn't kind of trigger anything, because it is a very big piece of luck. I was very lucky that this happened. It was somebody from junior high and high school that I knew, and they stepped forward saying, look, I don't know what this would look like for you. I know that you can't have children, and I want to help. I want to be a gestational carrier. It's something I've thought about forever. I mean, she is amazing. She's the most beautiful person. I love her. And it was just perfect. It wasn't like we grew up like we were super crazy close, but there was enough understanding and friendship there to know we could just automatically trust and have this conversation. And that was a couple of years ago. And with that, you must be thinking as a listener, okay, but you can't create your own kids. So what the heck do you do with that then? And that's kind of how we felt.
And before you go there, I just want to underscore this, because you're saying it with the enthusiasm and bubbliness that I've come to know to be true for you. But it is such an unusual and amazing thing for somebody who knows you to say, I would like to carry your child. That's,
don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
It is.
And do you know anything about her story? Do you know what led her to make that decision?
You know what? It's just been on her heart is the most commonly expressed reason that I've heard from her. And I know that she may have more in her story, and heck, maybe someday she'll come on here and talk about it, because it's a tough position to be in. And I know that this is like, woe is me, But it is a tough position to be in when somebody wants to give you such a wonderful thing, And so we've just been talking about it off and on for, all of these years. I think it's been about maybe actually even 3 or 4 years since that initial conversation. And I just then expressed to her, what it would take and what that would mean for us and what it does mean for us. As I mentioned, some listeners may be going, what the heck? You don't have ovaries. You were just talking about that. So how do you give her, an embryo to carry? And with that, we would use an egg donor. And that is something we are so lucky happened to us as well. A wonderful person called that we also were growing up, had friends, and at times would hang out in group settings and just knew each other kind of on the outside of shared friend circles and growing up together, going to the same high school. And she was a couple grades ahead of me. And she just called and said, look, I still know your story. I've never stopped thinking about it. And I want to donate my eggs to you. And I was like, whoa, that one was really heavy. That one I had to sit with, that bubbliness, that whole thing, that number one made it really real, because let me tell you, egg donors are wonderful people, but those agencies, they make a lot of money. It's a business at the end of the day. And while that can be, good and bad, it's got its good and its ugly side, right? It's just a big responsibility and a big thing because you have to click along quicker with that, right? I mean, you've got an age factor where you want to go through it and get the eggs as quickly as possible. Especially if somebody, it's so sad to say this, but like if you're over like 26 years old, they really are going to want to do some things pretty quickly and a lot of tests, and everything came back great. And it's a heavy thing to say, okay, great. Like, let's do this. Give me your eggs and let's do this. And as I mentioned, it's expensive. So, I go to my husband and I tell him what she offered, and he was feeling like this gestational carrier with an egg donor was the right path and what he was most comfortable for. And for me, I know a lot of the question has kind of been surrounding, what these pieces play into our family building and what it meant for us. And for me, I really looked to my husband to kind of see, as he married me, knowing I couldn't have kids completely comfortably, he didn't care at all about that. He knew that there was going to be a journey to a family, and I think had a bit of a dream of a family as well already on his own. And so with that, I wanted to look to him to see, like, what are you most comfortable with? Like, if this adoption thing isn't for you, then we're not going to do it. If you want to stick with no kids, then okay, like we can discuss that. Obviously, that is a possibility for us. So that's always on the forefront, that this whole thing may not work out. It may not take. But luckily with that, we got the ball rolling and we made some embryos and they're in the freezer.
It's incredible. So there's just so many incredible moments of this. And I'm sorry for having like a wow that I'm experiencing, even having heard your story before. Do you think there's something about you that inspires community members to step up and offer these enormous offers, both of body, to carry your child, and genetics to give or gift an egg?
Wow, I hope so, but I don't know. Like, I can't tell you that like I did something so special that would make people feel like I was more deserving. I really think it comes down to mutual respect as human beings. And I hope how I treat people and connect with people, which people are kind of my thing. Like, I love people. I love animals. I love beings, right? I love my plants. I get upset when they die. So I think it just comes down to hopefully just the kind of person I am in general, and not necessarily something major I did. And I think a big piece is that, unbeknownst to me, they had both been thinking about this for a while. So I think that played a big role too, where they were already comfortable with it. Meanwhile, to me, it's like, bam, there it is. They want to, help out and give me the biggest gift I think any humans possibly could. I'm pretty sure it wasn't anything special that I gave to the community or any crazy event I hosted or any contribution I made.
In the community of fertility, there's the concept of a known donor and an unknown donor.
Mm-hmm.
And a known donor is somebody who's either a friend, or there's a lot of ways to do it, or somebody that you meet online, et cetera. And in this case, you really know both donors, in particular the egg donor. Does that make you nervous at all that down the road that egg donor might regret their decision? Or was there any trepidation, or would you say this is just like so clearly designed to be the right path forward for you?
Oh my gosh. So I have no regrets thus far. I really think it's going to be a beautiful path. And I think the question was as well, would I be worried maybe that one of them might regret it as well? Okay, yeah. So I hope they don't regret it. And to be honest, it's such an interesting question to come up for me because I do worry about that in general. Or I mean, I already am. When I talk to them, especially right now with the egg donor, sometimes I want to talk to her like all the time and like, and just connect and keep her in my life forever and just like put her in my pocket, But I think sometimes people after doing something like that might want a little bit of space, and
Sure.
and figure out things on their end. And I think that is something that we have a little bit. And so I try and put that together in terms of like, okay, giving space, but also keeping her in my life and keeping up with each other and what's going on with the story and the saga of this whole journey to child. In terms of the gestational carrier, that girl, she's been so gung-ho and she has been so serious about doing this since she was like a teenager and started looking into it for the last, like, let's say 10 years. And I hope not, will ever regret it at all. I mean, she just seems so sure in her decision. And again, with the egg donor, it's not that she wasn't sure with her decision. You don't do anything like that very lightly. So I would hope that nobody would go through it and then regret it. But I just know like she just has so much going on in her life. And especially right now, there are some health things she's going through. And, I just think like, gosh, like she doesn't deserve this. She doesn't deserve this. And did I do this to her? I think about that every day. And you can't help when someone's going through some health things after doing one of the best things that they could do for somebody else, that you feel guilty or that they blame you or that they hate you for it or, resent you and your infertility for it. And so there are those moments where you do have to be thankful, but you have to sit with some of that. It's a big thing to carry. It's not just like, yay, I have a gestational carrier and an egg donor. I mean, it's probably something that my husband and I are going to carry with us forever, is this never ending, I don't know what word to use, like impulse to want to give back to them as much as we can, and not just monetarily, which neither of them have asked for, which is another like, are you flipping serious? But we intend to and have, even against them not asking for it. So, so we've done.
I do want to talk about that a little bit, in a minute. So what I'm hearing is like this overwhelming gratitude that is almost indescribable. I'm hearing you almost at a loss for words with the appreciation.
Yeah, it almost creates an awkwardness, to be honest. Should I contact her? Should I not? Should I reach out? Should I not? How do I do that? Should I go visit her in the hospital while she's going through some of these health issues? Should I not? Like, do I send something to the hospital? Does she not want to hear from me? Is she blaming this whole process on this? Like, it makes you nervous,
and it sounds like you're really in your head about it to some extent. Yeah. So let's talk about the logistics for a minute, because I think it's such a different process that you've experienced, having had these people emerge from the woodwork literally and gift you these incredible things. So you mentioned that you have embryos. So you did an egg extraction with this woman who was generously donating her eggs, and a doctor has created embryos for you. Tell us about the medical, the financial, and the legal components of getting to the phase where you're at now.
Oh, that's a great question too, because for any listeners maybe thinking about going down this path, I hope that I can kind of shine some light on what that looks like, because I had no idea. All I had going into this, was a Glamour magazine article, which was really exciting to read because you never get to read about people who did do egg donation with a gestational carrier. And so I hope that this will shine some light on that, because I know I was thankful for Glamour for what they did give me. So going forward, of course, we started with consultations with the doctor, and those are all paid for. just cash. Insurance does not really cover these things, which is really unfortunate. And I hope in the future we can see more of that, but there's that. So, you kind of start with that consultation, and he met with the egg donor and did some of those testing. We paid for all of that financially, cash. And then when it came to her passing these kind of markers he was looking for, that the doctor, being he, was looking for, it was time to move forward. So we started with the medication, still, cash. And before she started the medication, the most important piece was that legal piece. So it went from the consultation, meeting with the doctor, to the legal piece. Sorry, I'm kind of like backtracking here.
No, you're fine. So what you're saying is that it's important to get the legal component buttoned down, particularly with a known donor, before actually extracting the eggs. And what did the legal component have to say? Was it that she gives up all rights? Were there any visitation or ongoing relationship rights? What were some of the legal components that you guys had to navigate?
Right. So I think the biggest component of the legal portion is that you can't even move forward with the procedure until it's done. So that's why when I started talking about the medication, I had to backtrack real quick and be like, oh yeah, before we even did the medication, we had to get the legal portion buttoned down. The whole process took us about a year, but I don't think it necessarily has to take a year. It's just how it worked out for us. So with the legal portion, you're working with a lawyer on your end as the intended parents. When you're working as the intended parents, you're drafting a contract of things that you're hoping to have in there. So that could put in visitations if that's something that you want to kind of legally bind them to, so that your child can meet them, if that's something that means something to you as a family. So basically you're putting in all of these different items that you're looking towards. And yes, basically they are signing over parental rights, which is their goal as well. She kind of joked, look, I have my kids. Don't worry about me, and the gestational carrier kind of has too, which is kind of cute and funny in their own ways. Like, I'm done, which is another interesting component to both girls as well. They're both done with kids. So I think that plays into this. But so you work on this contract and you have your own lawyer. That lawyer then actually sends your contract to this other lawyer that acted as the egg donor's lawyer. Really what that means is that this lawyer was going to go over our contract as a third party with the egg donor, so that the egg donor could say yes, no.
So you want both parties to be represented is really and taken care of. And what did you guys ultimately settle on? So were there things that she asked for or advocated for to make sure that she was protected and happy with the decision?
Definitely. And that is one of the most important pieces of the contract, I think, to my husband and I, was that she did get that chance with her lawyer to be able to put in items such as any months that they may not want to go through with the procedure, or that they can't, and just have that legally binding portion there. If you're going to have any monetary items that are a part of the contract, whether it's as simple as, this amount of money for this procedure, that's where it goes. So it is an extremely important piece, and it is why it needs to be done before you can even start, the medication, and you get what's called, I think the doctor's office referred to it as legal authorization or legal approval, something like that. They actually get a copy of something, and they then say, okay, great, we're ready to go. Let's order the medication.
Oh, that's interesting. So it would be almost unethical to move forward medically until both parties were in agreement. The other question I had, which is, I think, really a point of curiosity for me, is have you guys decided if this woman is going to have visitation rights or anything related to an ongoing relationship with the future child?
So for us, I have always envisioned, somehow the biologically related donor, or if it was adoption, the biological mother, somehow be available for whether it be questions or just the child wanting to know who this special person is. I hope that they're interested in getting to know these two wonderful women that helped bring them to the world. But again, I want to go based off of what this child wants. And that's exactly where the egg donor and we have landed, is she's open to questions and meeting them if that's what they want. But she's also told me, like, I'm fine, whatever amount of contact you do or don't want to have when it comes to the child. And I'm a mama bear. So if you turn into a mama bear, you might not be comfortable with it. Like, I need you to know that. Like, she really kind of had like a little pep talk with me before we even saw the doctor. And we were just having coffee discussing and really getting to understand what it means to do this procedure. So that's kind of where we landed, is we're going to be looking to the child and let them know, look, like, it took a really special person to donate an egg and to gestationally carry you. And if you want to know them, you can. If you don't, that's okay. And so I think that the kid will hopefully know from the beginning so that those types of things can happen.
That's great. I think the child-directed methodology that you're using is really interesting. So now we have embryos. What's the next step for you guys?
So the next step is really locking in the gestational carrier portion of that. Egg donation was extremely expensive. So we're also, in a very real way, trying to kind of come back financially, from that. And the universe is a crazy thing. And when something's supposed to happen, it's going to make it happen. And we do have some things that I'll keep a little bit private, but share, that are just kind of clicking along and hopefully making it happen. So our next step is getting the gestational carrier, approved and all of that with the doctor, and testing through that and mapping out when implantation might be, not only just physically, but financially. That is something that you deal with fertility, is you could want to do it all day long, but if you don't have the money at that time, you can't necessarily do it. Not only does it cost like a lot of money to even just physically have a kid outside of the fertility costs, you also have to kind of figure out like your timing off and how that works with your job to be able to figure that out really well when it comes to the implantation and everything too. The possible gestational carrier does live a plane ride away, but not a long one, but a plane ride away. And, I have to figure all of that out financially, work-wise, all of that. So it is going to be a feat to figure it out. So the next step is probably multifaceted and many different steps, but hey, it's a new staircase. So we're thankful.
New staircase. I really love that. And what's amazing is that because of the way these two gifts came to you, they sort of, they were presented to you as these wonderful opportunities. You're going outside of the structure of an agency, which might handle a lot of the logistics for you. They're expensive.
Yes.
If you go through a surrogacy or a gestational carrier agency, it's really expensive, but they also manage the logistics of pre-vetting a potential surrogate biologically, emotionally, et cetera, and navigating some of these like things. So what are the things that you have to think about logistically without the aid of an agency? We talked a little bit about legal with the egg donor, but I imagine there's some things related to the gestational carrier as well.
That's a great question. I didn't ever really think too much about that because we were so lucky. You're just thinking, oh gosh, yeah, this is a great way to go. But you're right. Each way could come with pros and cons.
And it's not like you're just like, okay, great, we're going to bring you to a doctor's office and knock you up. Like, I imagine you have to know enough about how she is feeling right now and her cycle and, all those things. So what does that look like?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So with a directed gestational carrier like we are using, the doctor is going to have to do some testing and do that vetting. But you're right. You could imagine that it's already kind of vetted. But for the most part, I do think it makes it a little bit easier and definitely cheaper. I mean, some agencies are going to cost you anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000 just for the surrogacy portion and baby delivery. So, I mean, honestly, I think it brought us more pros than cons, but maybe just the vetting is the only portion that might look a little different than not working with an agency, as well as not paying somebody simply only 20 grand simply just to even start to match you with a surrogate. That portion was free. So I would say, when directed can be available, it's the way to go because it is so expensive to use an agency. But I will say this, though, that the egg donation process and the embryo creation process is going to cost, or did cost, more money than the implantation, which is just so interesting to me. I went into this thinking the gestational carrying portion is going to cost the most because this basically is an in vitro, just using an egg donor. And then the in vitro process is done on the gestational carrier. So, they'll connect and you think about how expensive IVF is. It is expensive. So I was the whole time thinking, okay, that's going to be the more expensive portion. Oh no, the egg donation and embryo creation portion was the most expensive. And I feel like that might be something that listeners were kind of interested in knowing too, and just understanding these different types of directed donors and gestational carriers, is that it still costs, so much. It's incredible. And just, it's not always what you think when you start walking these scenarios with fertility.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you mentioned that it's been many years in the making, and that's both financial and because it's complicated and it takes a lot of logistics. And I imagine it's almost like a second part-time job or something where you're really managing the details.
Yes, I can liken it to, and this isn't to trivialize the process or my story, but I liken it to almost like when you're buying a house. Like it's something that's going on in the background that requires a ton of attention, a ton of documents, a ton of appointments, and a ton of just getting things done and figured out that maybe you haven't done before, especially if you're a first-time home buyer. So it's almost kind of like that, where there's a lot of people that want you to hurry up, get this done, and wait. Like it's a lot of hurry up and wait, or planning a wedding. Also kind of like that. And it's kind of all consuming like that as well.
How do you manage your emotions or your partner, your husband's emotions through these ups and downs and these big movements forward and then hurry up and wait time periods?
I think just a lot of trying to enjoy what you have now. And one of the pieces that got us there, I think, is that we've had to have many conversations of what it would be like to maybe even not have a child, which in all honesty is a modern day conversation even couples who may be able to have their own children have today, and is an empowering conversation. So I think just having those conversations and getting comfortable with where we are with ourselves and our home and our lives, and appreciating what you have, and that the child is the bonus. Just let it be a bonus. Let it be a blessing. Don't let it be an all-consuming thing. And I think that that's so much easier said than done with the infertility process. And maybe, again, I am lucky in that I found out when I was so young that I've had a lot more time to process and not build this kind of dream and this idea of what my life was going to be like, and then it gets shattered. That, I will admit with privilege, did not happen to me. So I feel like I've always had the idea that, yep, this is what I really want, is to have a family, but it may not happen. And you want to know what? There's a third option. It might not happen exactly the way I'm thinking as well. Like maybe, we have a certain amount of embryos. Right now we have 5, which is around a common-ish number. Right. And we only have each shot as it's given, right? We've got a gestational carrier who is willing to discuss implanting 1, right? So it's like, that might be the only one. It may not take, those are things that we've had to talk about of, okay, how, if it doesn't take, how many times would we want to try? And I think that when we're talking about dealing with emotions and keeping yourself going during these kind of complicated processes, is that sometimes people are on the outside looking in, seeing something completely different. I think a lot of times people view infertility issues as solvable. They struggle with infertility, but once that baby does come, it's just going to be harder. And it's you have to know that a lot of us with infertility have to get comfortable with the idea of what it might look like to not have a kid, and let that be empowering, not a defeatist notion. And so I think to kind of circle back, we just use that notion of, you know what, if it doesn't work, how cool is this going to be? We'll do this and we'll do that then. And then, okay, we could do this and we'll travel here and we'll travel there. We just kind of express what we would want that life to look like, because, we would want to fill it up with some exciting things, is you have to protect yourself and make sure that you're going to have a life that you're going to be comfortable with. And I think that, again, that just made us feel more empowered and comfortable knowing and moving forward with something that may or may not totally work out.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I love this, let it be a blessing. Mm-hmm. It brings us very much full circle to the beginning when we talked about it as being interim or a journey. If you're enjoying the journey, or as you described it, building a life that you're really happy with, even without a child, then everything else is the gravy. It's the blessing.
Yes.
And to your point, just because there are great resources available to people who are experiencing infertility does not mean the end result always comes out the same way.
Right. And it doesn't mean that if they don't have a child because of infertility, that they chose, a quote, easier route or just totally cried defeat. Like, no, sometimes it's an empowering decision.
We have to make those decisions. We all have to make those decisions. So given that your family could look like you and your husband living this incredible life, or it could look like a family that was built with the aid of a lot of really generous community members. Mm-hmm. How do you define family?
Wow. So family to me is unconditional love. And this is such a cool question because it's not one I've ever been asked or really thought about before. I come from a humongous family. My mom is one of 9 children. My dad is one of 4. And then he also has 3 half siblings as well. So really he's one of 7. So it's love, it's togetherness, it's your people. So yeah, I say that with knowing that I have a privilege of 2 huge sides to my family that are connected and talk and get together. And I feel really lucky for that. So that is going to be something I think I'll carry with me as I work towards, bringing this little baby to the world, because that's something to think about. Like, what do I want the family to look like in my home? Right. Mm-hmm. So, and it is going to look maybe different than some of my family in that we are going to have discussions about me not being biologically related, but being, environmentally and, emotionally and all those other pieces that I'm losing words for, the mother, the one who is raising the child. And so, wow, that's a really important question that I'm totally going to probably have to think about even more.
That's wonderful. And I appreciate your willingness to work through what's in your head with us today.
Absolutely.
Paige, where can we find you? Do you want to be found on social media? Do you want to share your podcast at all?
Sure. So I have a podcast, as we've kind of mentioned in and out here. It's called The Murder Diaries. It is a weekly true crime podcast. And my friend Natalie and I both co-host. It is a lot of fun. We try and empower true crime victims to, just be their voice. You can check us out on Instagram at The Murder Diaries Pod. And that's where I'm very active on there, as is Natalie. And I'm also Paige Irene 919 on Instagram. It's a little bit of an art account, but that's a great place to find me as well for any listeners that are like, oh my gosh, I want to reach out. I have to do this same path with infertility and I don't know where to start. Like, I'm totally open to questions. You can DM.
That is such a generous offer. Thank you for that. And if somebody wants to learn more about Turner syndrome, what are some online resources you can direct them to?
So TurnerSyndromeFoundation.org would be a great place to start. As well, there's just a plethora of information just from Google. But I would say that TurnerSyndromeFoundation.org is a great place to learn about living with Turner syndrome, caring for people with Turner syndrome, as well as there's a really cool portion of the website that says TS Explained. And so it kind of starts with what is Turner syndrome, goes into common symptoms. I know I listed some that I had kind of had and then, went away, and others that other people have. But again, the list is so long. So yeah, you can definitely learn more there. And just remember what you are learning. It also looks very different for people with a mosaic form versus people who don't have a mosaic form. So when you learn about it, it might take you down a little bit of a rabbit hole.
Thank you so much for your willingness to be open about your own experiences as somebody with Turner syndrome and also with this really incredible fertility journey. I can't wait to see how the story unfolds. And I know our listeners would love an update if and when you're ready.
Absolutely. I'll keep everybody posted. And thank you so much for letting me share my story. It's never let me down. So happy to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paige.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.